Hi, everyone. It's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm excited to tell you that my book is now for sale. It's called Divorcing Religion, a Memoir and Survival Handbook. And I'll make sure you have a link in the notes for that. And also, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and become a member of my YouTube channel. Take care. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selbie. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. Today, you are joining us for part 2 called Tinfoil Hats and Lizard People. I'm so excited to bring back Cynane Shay. Cynane is a nuclear engineer living in South Carolina. Her childhood in white Christian nationalism normalized conspiracy theories like Obama birtherism and the biblical apocalypse. But 2020 with COVID and QAnon finally made her realize something was deeply wrong. Now Cynane is writing a book, Taking Off the Tinfoil Hat, How Lizard People and Space Lasers Dismantled My Christian Worldview, to process the deconstruction of her fundamentalist evangelical faith and her propagandistic patriotism. Losing loved ones to the pandemic was truly a tragedy, but losing loved ones to the rabbit hole was its own tragedy that left too many of us with unresolved trauma and unanswered questions. So from flat Earth to the IBLP cult to Jewish space lasers, Cynane pulled the thread, cracked her faith, and found the inseparable link between cults, conspiracy theories, and American white Christian nationalism. I have been waiting so long, it feels like, to do part 2 of this. When we left off last day, Cynane, you had carried through with your wedding. You got married to your love. You did have to disinvite your maid of honor because of her own COVID beliefs. And then you also found out that your beloved brother had fallen prey to these conspiracy theories as well. And that really prompted you to do a deep dive, to start looking at what the heck is going on with these crazy conspiracy theories. I'm so glad to see you back again. How are you doing?
Hi, I am good. I'm back. Thank you so much for continuing the conversation. Just from the point where we left off, I was, that's kind of like, that was my personal story of deconstruction. At the point of my wedding was in October, my maid of honor was completely lost. My parents, my brother, a bunch of my other friends were also like down the rabbit hole. And it got to Christmas that year. So it was about 2 months after the wedding where I had just been in this mentality of just make it through the wedding, just make it through the wedding. Like, I must not understand what's going on. I have to be wrong. Like, things can't possibly be this bad. And there was just enough time after the wedding, after getting over that hurdle, that I had a little bit of time to like decompress. And it was the stupidest thing, but just like one little feather more finally pushed me over the edge at Christmas that year. And the maid of honor that I had to kick out of my wedding, Kathy, she posted like one more thing. And compared to everything else that had been posted, like it really wasn't that bad, but it was just, Biden wants us all to die from the pandemic or like some nonsense like that. And then at the same time, I had a friend from work and a friend from undergrad who were also home visiting their families for Christmas. They simultaneously texted me. They don't know each other. They knew that I knew a lot about QAnon. And so they were like, hey, I'm home for Christmas. My dad is saying some crazy conspiracy theory stuff. Like, what do I do? And
Wow.
I didn't have an answer for them. I was like, I can tell you what is happening. I can tell you what they believe, where it is coming from, but I cannot tell you what to do about it. I cannot help you. And it was this final push over the edge, of it felt so unfair that now I knew other people were dealing with it, but like other people were dealing with it now. And it felt like a physical snap. when people talk about their deconstruction, they talk about, going to college and like meeting new friends and like, slowly asking more questions and things. And for me, it was a single moment. On December 24th, 2021, I instantaneously deconstructed because I hit a breaking point of overwhelming cognitive dissonance. And from there, I would not have immediately said, oh, I don't believe in God anymore. That wasn't it. It was just the indoctrination was broken. And from there, I could start to actually look at my beliefs critically for the very first time. And that obviously took a long time. Over the next year, I was completely in turmoil, consuming information as soon as I could find resources and books and things. And, basically the conclusion that I came to from all of this and what really finally helped me was when I found conversation about cults and cult psychology and indoctrination. And I came to the conclusion that the reason that people believe conspiracy theories is the same reason that they fall into cults. They are looking to fulfill social and psychological needs, which is, why people seek religion. And conspiracy theories and cults and religion, they fulfill these needs. It's not that people are doing them for no reason. But there's a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who's the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and he says that once you've eliminated all of the impossible options, whatever's left, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And what Robert J. Lifton and Janja Lalich, who are both cult psychologists, talk about is this bounded choice, or I think personal closure is another term for the same thing, of you view the world through a very specific lens, and you remove part of reality as impossible when viewed through the lens of a group's totalistic ideology. And so whatever's left, no matter how improbable, it must be the truth. And what you are left with, it matters what your totalistic ideology is. And this is why when you talk about cults, all of the books that I've read say that, it's not about like a specific belief. It's not always centered around religion or finance or environment, or you can have a cult on any subject. It's more to do with the structure and the unethical, manipulative, deceptive tactics that are used to get you to adopt a holistic ideology, the thought reform tactics. And for how I grew up, what my family came from, and why I believe all of the white evangelicals fell head over heels for QAnon. And there are other groups of people that fell for these conspiracy theories too. But we have to talk about this just like overwhelming statistics on white evangelicals is because of the totalistic ideology of white Christian nationalism. And for me, and what, I'm kind of trying to work into my book is what I had to deconstruct, how I perceived this worldview, is what I think other people are going to have to deconstruct. And the twin pillars for me were American exceptionalism and this biblical inerrancy, kind of like Tim LaHaye left behind dispensational theology. And the American exceptionalism element of it is a lot easier to deconstruct because it's just facts and history, and you can go back and you can read the quotes from the founding fathers and how much they hated religion and, how they were deists and they weren't fundamentalists, and how the Constitution was constructed and able to enforce separation of church and state. Like that is just history. And you can look at how absolutely, fucked American history is to see that it is not American exceptionalism. We are not specially blessed by God. Like we are built on slavery and segregation and Native American boarding schools and just horrible, horrible things. The biblical inerrancy side was a lot more difficult to deconstruct because it is more religious. That's where the indoctrination comes in. And you can look at this in a bunch of different ways. You read all the books about why people believe conspiracy theories, and they give you lists of logical fallacies. And, the human mind is just not built to understand massive numbers or incredibly small numbers. We're prone to believe that we understand things better than we do. We are prone to, put ourselves under authority, like unquestionably. We have this intention bias and this teleological mindset that like really predisposes us to religion and to conspiracy theories and to cults and all of this. But the other aspect of this that I really have like honed in on recently is kind of more of a historical understanding of where did this white Christian nationalist totalistic ideology come from. And if you talk to people who have studied white Christian nationalism, and you read the books like Jesus and John Wayne and The Color of Compromise, and there's so many of these fantastic histories that I think need to be just like required reading for everybody. They typically start around the 1970s, 1980s, maybe 1960s. And I think that is correct. I think that is, when you're talking about modern white Christian nationalism has existed since, the founding of the country. But this particular movement started in the 1970s and 1980s. You think the moral majority, you think Tim LaHaye and Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich and getting Reagan elected. That is a very important part of this. But it's more the history and less like the history of the ideology. I want to go a lot farther back. So, and it's going to sound like it's not going to make sense. And by the end, I cannot promise you that it will make sense, but I'm going to do my best. So if you start in where Hannah Arendt starts in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which I think is a fantastic place to start. She focuses, her book is cut into 3 sections. And the first section is a discussion of antisemitism, a discussion of imperialism, and then a discussion of totalitarianism. And she is looking at, obviously, the Nazis and how did that happen. And starting with antisemitism, you have to start in the Middle Ages and back in the 1100s, where the history of anti-Semitism had a lot to do with like feudalism and how the Catholic Church functioned with the state in like medieval times. And in 1144, there was a Benedictine monk who basically went on a witch hunt, and he wrote this like manifesto. There was a young boy who was found dead, and this guy said it's the Jews, and he wrote this out in some sort of something that was published, so there's like a record of it, and this set off a string of essentially kind of like pogroms, just trigger warning for everything that we're going to discuss. A lot of violence, a lot of like genocide and discrimination, but a lot of attacks, like every 3 to 5 years from 1168, 71, 82, all the way to almost 1300. England, France, Germany, Spain, everywhere. Anytime somebody went missing, was found murdered, it was just scapegoated onto the Jewish community in the area. Wow. And that had to do with like, because there was no separation of church and state, the Catholic Church basically ran everything. And so Jewish people and just anybody who wasn't like a Catholic did not have the same rights as Catholic people did. And so they were in society, but they were separate from society. They dressed differently. They spoke a separate language. They had different cultures, and they had a different religion, which was like very much feared. And so they became a very easy scapegoat. And this, just goes back to human in-group, out-group, tribalism. And when the 14th century came around, you had the plague. And so anytime somebody got sick, they would often also blame Jewish people. They had all these conspiracy theories of like well poisonings and things. And this went on for hundreds of years into the 14, 15, 1600s. A lot of the a couple of the people who were murdered were basically sanctified. They were made into official Catholic saints, with in the record saying that they had been murdered by Jewish people, which was not necessarily true. So this was like officially sanctioned conspiracy theories. And this is where the blood libel conspiracy theory comes from. It was, there's just this popular idea that Jewish people were sacrificing either young Christian children or priests in satanic blood rituals. And this has been a conspiracy theory that has been around since the 1100s. And so that is just sort of like bedrock, right? This is a history that plays a background to everything that comes after it.
I just want to ask then, or point out that, I mean, if you believe the Bible is true or accurate or literal or whatever, certainly back then, people saying it was the Jews who put the Savior to death. So I feel like that's even going farther back. And I'm sure a lot of this that you've just been talking about has roots in all that.
Yeah. Never mind the fact that Jesus was a Jew.
I know. Okay.
Yeah. So and we have to go down a couple like really weird little rabbit holes, because the conspiracy theorists that have relevance to today went down these rabbit holes. So to get into their mind, basically, there was another, like, in the early 1100s, you also had the Crusades. The first one was in like 1096 or something, so like right around 1100. And then the second one happened, 1120-ish time frame. And you had the Knights Templar, who were a part of this. They weren't a part of the first crusade, but they did exist in time for the second crusade. And they started out as this military monks, basically, which is an oxymoron. And they started as an order specifically to ferry pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, to Jerusalem. So in the first crusade, the Christians basically kind of took over Jerusalem, and then all of these Christians were taking the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the Holy Land, much like white evangelicals do today. But they were waylaid by bandits and robbers and stuff all the time. And so the Knights Templar was formed as basically a ferry service for them. And over the next 200-ish years into the 1300s, they became this massive organization, and they amassed immense wealth. It was an order that had like taken a vow of poverty and celibacy, obviously, and monkey type things, like monks, not monkeys. And they ended up they basically kind of became almost like the first international bank, because they were affiliated with the Catholic Church, but they had bases in like every major country of the time, like France and England and all these places. And they would get recruitment, and they would get money, and the church and various kings and things would donate them estates. And so they amassed immense wealth. And then they would loan that wealth back to the kings, in order so that the kings of the different countries could then go on crusade, so that they could fund these battles and attack like Islamic people in the Middle East. And I've read like one book about the Knights Templar, and basically everybody just dies of dysentery. Spoiler alert. But they yeah. How the Knights Templar ended was very important, because, and there's definitely debate between different scholars and things about like how this went, but very roughly. The King of France at the time, in like 1300, was basically separation of church and state. The state was winning in this case. Like the state was kind of like the French monarchy had more influence than the Catholic Pope did. And so he basically was throwing his weight around, was kind of controlling the Catholic Pope, didn't like one guy. So he just like got rid of him, said that he was, worshiping Satan and performing all sorts of like sexual improprieties, and then replaced him with a new Pope that he liked better. And he was short on cash. And so one of the tricks that people of this time would do, and he wasn't the only king to do this, was to scapegoat Jewish people again. And so he basically kicked them all out of France and then stole all of their stuff. And so, he killed obviously a ton of Jewish people and, kicked them out of, and this happens like all throughout history where they're like forced to migrate. And so he did this with the Jewish population in France at that time. And then he was like still short on cash. So he turned his attention to the Knights Templar and, he owed them money or he wanted their money. And so he basically did the same thing. He claimed that, like with the Pope, like with Jewish people, he used the same theme every time of just they are worshiping Satan and they're performing like, typically homosexual sexual acts, which was like seen as evil. And he rounded up all of the Knights Templar. The head of the order, Jacques de Molay, or James de Molay, is very famous. And he was, I want to say, burnt at the stake. But like he and a bunch of these other knights were rounded up, put into French prisons for years, months, years. A lot of them died in prison. A lot of them starved from disease and things. They were tortured into admitting that they had worshipped Satan, and, had a lot of words put into their mouths. And a bunch of people under torture confessed to doing a bunch of things. So then the Pope had to get involved because now there were confessions. And so then other countries started doing this. Anyway, they essentially disbanded the Knights Templar. But now we have these like church records of the Knights saying that they were a secret order. There was a secret order within the secret order, and that they were worshiping Satan, specifically like the head of Baphomet. And there again is like historical debate over like if this existed, and if it did exist, what was it? Some people say that actually it was like a statue of the head of the Saint John, so it could have been many things. And and then there was this conspiracy theory that some faction of the Knights Templar survived, and specifically that they ran off to the Scotland area, and that they set up like a secret society there where they survived this like purge. And if you move,
that's how we get to the Freemasons.
Yes.
Okay, all right, I'm with you.
Yeah, you're picking it up. So then in, the Freemasons time frame, there's a lot of debate on like when the Freemasons started. Usually they say that they existed in some form back with like the actual like Mason guilds and things in the 1400s. But the first official Grand Lodge was founded in London in 1717. So we have skipped a couple hundred years. And right away, 1738, you have the Catholic Church decrying them. There's a papal bull where the Pope basically is like anti-Freemason, and that had a lot to do with politics, shockingly. And it had to do with the England. And like there was this debate over like who the rightful king was, the Stuarts and the Jacobites and the Jacobins and the Hanoverians. And I'm not an English scholar, but really it just had to do with this kind of like what was happening in England was Catholic versus Protestant, and the Freemasons were viewed as largely Protestant. They weren't all. And so the Pope cracked down on them because it was just like, well, we're just not going to do this. And then also you have just generally like a group that is separate from both the church and the state that is drawing people's allegiance and loyalty, and that's a threat to these authoritarian structures. And so I did skip, there was one other thing that was really important in this time was the Rosicrucians. And that was in I have notes and it's just like all over the place. In like 1610, there was a series of books that were put out from 1610. It was officially published in 1614, and 1615, 1616. So like, um, near-ish Shakespearean times. And they were essentially, again, people don't really know where this stuff came from, but there's a pretty good idea that this was a hoax. And you had a couple different books that were published, Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and then The Chemical Wedding, that were kind of these like alchemical diatribes, and they were sort of like this, they were allegories, and they were symbolism, and it was all rooted in kind of like alchemy, which at the time alchemy wasn't what we think of it as today. Like, it was sort of mystical and spiritual and religious, but it also was kind of like how science developed at the time. Like, people thought this was a real science.
Oh.
And so a group of students and a professor in Germany allegedly published some of these books, and it was supposed to be like a revealing of a secret society called the Rosicrucians, or the Order of the Rosy Cross, that had allegedly existed for hundreds of years, and it was just now being made public. And it was made up in 1610, but allegedly it had existed for eons. And if you just like thought really hard about it and like put out good vibes into the universe, like a Rosicrucian recruiter would like come find you. And so newspapers were like flooded with people submitting like things saying like, I want to join the Rosy Cross, I want to join. And of course, nobody ever heard back from the Rosicrucian order. But then over the next couple of years, like hundreds of publications were put out about the Rosy Cross, of just other people like jumping on this bandwagon, being like, oh, well, I'm actually in the Rosy Cross, and like, this is how we do it. And it spread all over the place, and it really ballooned. But again, it's about secret societies and things. And then in the 1776, which is, America's year as well, was also the year that the Illuminati was founded. And this was, the secret order to end all secret orders. Like, this is the shit. And it was started by this guy named Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, in Germany again. And what actually happened was that the Illuminati survived like maybe 12 years, and then it was completely disbanded. He wanted it to be a secret society, kind of like the Freemasons. And Bavaria at the time was basically ruled by an iron fist by the Jesuits, which was another Catholic order. And they had complete control over the education system of the colleges and schools and things. And while the rest of Europe in 1776 was going through the Enlightenment, and you had all of these like great philosophical thinkers and kind of working out democracies and things, Bavaria was behind the ball. They were not involved in this. And so the Illuminati was literally just a banned book club. He was smuggling in Enlightenment books for him and all of his, like, he was like a professor and a lawyer, and so all of his college buddies. And he was kind of an asshole. And so he had like really, really strict requirements for you to be in this secret order, and you had to like write dissertations, and you had to like snitch on your like fellow Illuminati members and things. And so it wasn't very popular. They kept meticulous records. Yeah. So we have like an idea of how many people were involved, but they were, it was just like, it was probably just people who signed up and then like were not actually really involved in it. So like maybe a couple hundred people. And then again, after like 10 to 12 years, the Bavarian state, Weishaupt crossed a line with the Bavarian state, and then they basically crushed it out of existence. And like, that was the end of the Illuminati. And it would have been the end of the Illuminati. And we wouldn't be talking about it today because we wouldn't know what it was if it weren't for the French Revolution. And so the French Revolution happened in 1789. So this was after the American Revolution, obviously. And it was pretty bloody. They had the guillotines and all of that. And it's fascinating because it's almost so similar to today, because we have all of these like Elon Musk bros.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like the guys who were like defending Jeff Bezos and fans.
Oligarchs.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And the same thing happened with the French Revolution. You had the aristocrats of the time and this like very imbalanced social financial structure. And, there were still people who were defending that system, who were saying that like this is the right way to do things, and like they wanted to stand up for the billionaires. And so there were two people, and I do believe that they did know each other, or had at least met. So there was Abbe Berruel, who was French, and then there was John Robison, who was, I want to say, Scottish, and they both published books in 1797, which was, 8-ish years after the French Revolution. So this is like very fresh. Like the French Revolution is still like, people are talking about it. People are trying to figure out, why did this happen? How did this happen? And they both published books with answering that question. And their answer was the Illuminati. And so they're both they're very, very similar conspiracy theory, just like manifestos talking about how, it wasn't the, financial disparity and the social hierarchy and the Enlightenment that like caused the French Revolution. It was a secret group of satanic, secret society people, and the Enlightenment was evil and was causing us to stray from God and causing us to stray from the church. And so they both published these books around the same time. Robison's was in English, and so it got quite popular in the United States. So there are records of letters. Specifically, there was one pastor, I want to say his name was Morse, who picked this up. And at the time, they would publish their sermons, and those were very popular. They would write them and publish them, and those would get handed around as pamphlets and things. And so somebody, I think maybe Morse himself, sent a copy of his sermon about the Illuminati to George Washington. And there's correspondence back from George Washington being like, oh, wow, like this is so important. Thank you so much for showing me. And so like George Washington was like low key kind of an Illuminati conspiracy theorist. But at the time, you didn't have like the internet and stuff. It was just, and it was coming from a pastor. It's a very reputable source. And this was very, very popular. The Abbe Berruel was French. And then within a couple years, or I don't know how long, of him publishing his version, he edited it on a reprint to include also, not only is it like the Freemasons and the Illuminati, but also it's Jewish people. So he made his super anti-Semitic. And so this is all pretext. This is all just context. So, and then this is where it gets like actually crazy. And I'm like obsessed with this. Oh my God,
buckle up, people.
Because there's something called the Taxiel hoax. And I've read a lot of books about conspiracy theories and the history of conspiracy theories, and where a lot of them start, and again, I think very rightfully and very justfully, is in discussing the history of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was put out kind of in like the early 1900s, like 1920, 30 timeframe, just in time for Hitler. And you can trace the history of that back to multiple different sources. One of them was just like this post office worker who was just like a nasty anti-Semitic loser. And he wrote like a fan fiction that was like super anti-Semitic about a cabal of Jewish rabbis like meeting in a cemetery. And then that got kind of married with a couple other sources. One of them was like a Russian like police propaganda, because they were trying to justify committing pogroms against Jewish people and like genocide and things. And basically what came out of all of that was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, if you go to the Holocaust Museum official website, there's a page on this, and it describes it as the single most damaging anti-Semitic publication in human history. And its whole shtick is that there's a satanic cabal of Jewish elites who are pulling the strings of global governments and economies to drive the world towards kind of like a one world order that like Jewish people can control. And, you know, there may or may not be some like satanic sacrifice thrown in there. And that sounds exactly like QAnon, because it's just plagiarized. Hitler used this as propaganda during World War II. It was wildly popular. But some of the influences that created the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that does not get a lot of attention is the tax seal hoax. And that kind of started in 1891, so before the turn of the century. And it was in France. There was this guy called Leo Taxiel, and that's not his real name. That's his like pen name, but I'm not going to pretend to try to pronounce his actual name. And he was essentially an 1890s 4chan troll. He was a con man, and I think he was kind of brilliant in an evil kind of way. And he hated the Catholic Church. And so he would make money by writing anti-clerical erotic novels. So he'd write like pornos basically about nuns and the Pope and all this stuff. And he was just trying to be as heretical as possible to offend as many people as possible.
Yay.
And, yay. Which is why it was like kind of funny. And he joined the Freemasons, because it just, it's the thing to do in 1890. And he only got to like the first level. There's 33 levels, and he got kicked out pretty quickly because he's a con artist, and he like stole somebody else's book and published it under his name. And so they kicked him out. So then he pivoted his grift, and he said very publicly that he had converted to Catholicism, and that he had a vision of Joan of Arc, and that he was now a Christian. And so he goes to like a priest, or I'm not Catholic, so I don't know their structure very well, like a bishop or something. And he says, I'm a Christian now. I want to repent. They eat it up. They love it. And then he turns around and starts publishing books exposing the Freemasons, saying like, I'm an ex-Freemason. I've escaped. I'm a good Christian boy now. And so he starts exposing Freemasons. And there was a whole vein of literature for this at the time. So remember, like the Pope put out something in 1738. So there's like, by this point, several hundred years of history of like Catholic Freemason angst. There are other books already that have been published that are like anti-Freemason on the grounds of Christianity. And they even go so far as to say that Freemasons are satanic, but they typically stick to Freemasonry is satanic because it's not Christian. Anything that's not Christian must be of the devil. Leo Taxiel takes that a step farther, and he's like, no, they are satanic because they are literally worshiping the devil. And he builds this whole like Harry Potter level, like Middle Earth kind of alternate reality. And he starts by writing, and I think he's very clever. He starts by writing books about, are there women in Freemasonry, which was not allowed. And he taps into the moral panic of basically misogyny of like, we have to protect the women, which is the same thing that we're seeing today, which is the same thing that we saw to justify segregation, is like, we have to protect the women. There are women in these Freemason lodges. They're being led to sexual immorality. They're essentially brothel houses. And so that took off. And then he gets a couple of his buddies to also start writing books. And they're corroborating what he's saying. So he's saying like, oh, I escaped the Freemasons. This is what I saw inside the houses. And then now he has other people providing evidence to say, oh, yes, that's all true. And he builds this whole idea that there is a secret order within the secret order. So the Freemasons is just like your run-of-the-mill secret order. And not all Freemasons are satanic, but there's a secret order inside of the Freemasons called the Palladians, and they are satanic, and they are actively like worshiping the Baphomet. They have a giant Baphomet statue. They can summon Satan himself. They are performing like satanic miracles. He has his friend write this book or series of books. It was actually a series of penny dreadfuls, which is famously not a very reputable publication source. But he writes a series of penny dreadfuls of him pretending to be a doctor who had encountered the Palladian order and had secretly infiltrated it to fight it like for God. And then he goes on like a Bilbo Baggins style adventure across the planet, from like Italy to Calcutta, India to Singapore, and goes everywhere he goes. He finds a satanic order. He happens to be the night of some grand magical event, and they, there's people who are like melting, people who are flying, people who are being like, it's really nasty, like just grotesquely tortured in front of people. Satan will show up and like just like murder some people. And in this series of publications that come out over the next couple of years, he introduces characters. So now there are women in Freemasonry. There are women in the Palladian Order, and Sophie Walder is kind of like the bad guy, and then Diana Vaughn is kind of like the good guy. And
these are characters that they made up.
Yes. Yes.
Oh my God.
Because the women in these lodges are basically competing to be the grandmother of the Antichrist. And they're all like dating demons. So like Diana Vaughn is like dating Asmodeus. And Diana Vaughn is still a virgin though. So Sophie Walder is not a virgin. She's not worth saving anymore. But Diana Vaughn is still a virgin. And so, she's kind of sympathetic to the reader. And and he's very, very clever because he says that, so in reality, the Freemason lodges are largely autonomous. So like the Grand Lodge of England is more or less autonomous from the Grand Orient Lodge of France. But in Leo Taxiel's telling, no. Actually, they're all connected. It's a giant international cabal, and it's headed by essentially a dark pope. And the anti-pope is the head of all of the Palladian Order, is based in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where I am, which I think is hilarious. And which was convenient for him because Charleston was across the ocean. So it was very hard to check up on things for people who were reading this. And he said that it was Albert Pike, who was the head of the lodge in the United States, which was based in Charleston, who was a real person and who was actually the head of the American Lodge. And this guy and this guy was an ex-Confederate general. And there are writings from Albert Pike from when he was the head of the Freemasons and of the American Lodge of the Freemasons. And so he says that like Diana Vaughn is American. She comes from Kentucky. She lives in Charleston. She's at like the head house, and he write, and this is important. He writes that, he transcribes things that Albert Pike allegedly said, like, we're here to worship Satan or whatever. And so, he's making millions of dollars in equivalent money by publishing all of this. It is wildly popular. People like are like buying these up, and he then pivots right and says that Diana Vaughn does convert to Catholicism. He says that she gets saved. She has she's now a Christian. She's following Jesus, and so then he starts writing books as Diana Vaughn. And
oh my God, it is brilliant.
Yeah. And then he's making a ton more money. And like people were like writing into newspapers at the time, like saying, I'm praying for Diana Vaughn and like all this stuff. And at the end of all of this, so again, like I think it was before 1900. I think it had about a 9-year run, 8 to 9 years. He and his cohort start to fall out. One guy like starts to kind of like give it away and like talk to the press and say like, no, we made this all up. And so Leo Texiel has to get ahead of it. And so he stages a conference where he says that Diana Vaughn is going to come out of hiding, because she had been in hiding after she converted to Christianity because Sophie Walder was like trying to hunt her down to kill her. So she's going to come out of hiding. She's going to do a press conference and like confirm all of this. And so the place is packed. He fills it up with press and people, and he gets up on stage and he's just like, fuck you guys. I made it all up. I was just trying to show how gullible the Catholic Church is and how you guys will just believe anything that you want to believe if it aligns with your bias. And like there's writings of him saying like, we had so much fun writing this stuff, like making fun of people, and would come up with the most ridiculous thing they could think of, thinking, surely this is what's going to get us caught because nobody's going to believe this. Talking about like, a demon turning a table into an alligator that then went and like played the piano for all the Palladians. And how Diana Vaughn was actually like the daughter of a moon goddess that, had an interaction with, there was actually a famous occultist named Vaughn back in like the 1600s. And funnily enough, he really did his research because that occultist, Vaughn, was the first person to translate some of the Rosicrucian texts into English. So there's like a very much a through line, and like all of this is seeped in this history of like occultism and Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry that like I feel like a lot of us miss today because it's not relevant anymore.
And also the bypassing of critical thinking that's required for believing in Christianity in general. You have to believe in a talking snake, a talking donkey, and a virgin birth. So they're already primed. People are already primed to believe nonsense.
And specifically in this instance, they are primed to be anti-Freemason. So the Freemasons are already bad. They might as well be, flying around on demons or whatever. And so the Leo Texiel comes out as a hoax, and just absolutely hilarious. But not hilarious because it like absolutely just like melted all of history, because the church is rightfully embarrassed. And one, it's in the 1900s. So he says it's a hoax. They might have put it in the newspaper that it was a hoax. Not everybody's going to see that. A lot of people are just going to carry on believing that, one of the things that they read a couple years ago was true, and they never think about it again. And now that's just like what they think and what they believe and what they teach their kids. And so it really like amplified the anti-Masonic rhetoric. And then the church did not help, because they were like, okay. He was a con artist, sure, but he was mostly correct. He might have made up some of that stuff, but like the core argument of it is surely true. And so they just doubled down. And they don't have to admit that they were wrong, and they're not going to. And so this is at the turn of the century. At the same time, you had a couple other texts come out that were influenced by the Leo Taxiel books. The first one came out in 1891. By 1893, this guy called Murin, he was a clergy member of the Catholic Church, an abbe, I think. He wrote his own version of anti-Masonic conspiracy theories called Freemasonry Satan's Synagogue. And you can tell from the title that he basically took a lot of this stuff and like added extreme anti-Semitism to it and said that like it's not just the Freemasons, it's also Jewish people. And so that was one of the influences into the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So just this conspiracy theory milieu, this sort of information just kind of being in the public consciousness, and then specifically certain texts like Murin's book directly influenced and led into the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which has had just absolutely devastating effects. Even to today, it's horrible. And then this all, as ridiculous as it sounds, as, you know, piano playing demon alligators. And there was also something about how Albert Pike had a Satan-powered telephone system where he could talk to all of the other like major lodges in the world by like rubbing a satanic silver toad, and then like somehow he could like talk to the other lodges and stuff. Like actually crazy nonsense. Directly ties into white Christian nationalism and Trump today. This was at the turn of the century. This was like pre-World War II, during World War II, and then in that time frame, you had 3 women who existed kind of concurrently, and they all kind of knew each other. One of them was called Nesta Webster, and that's the one that I'm going to really focus on. But also there was a woman called Leslie Fry. That was also a pen name, not her real name, and Edith Starr Miller. And Leslie Fry and Edith Starr Miller were like besties. They actually like co-wrote a book together. They also like had their own publications and things. And Leslie Fry is particularly interesting because I believe she was American, or she at least lived in America, and she was accused of being a paid Nazi propagandist. She lived 1882 to 1970, so she lived like through World War II. She tried to revitalize the KKK. I think she was like, they tried to charge her for being a Nazi, but like I think she was never actually like prosecuted because they didn't have the evidence or something. But she is credited with having introduced the protocols of the Elders of Zion and Nesta Webster's work to Henry Ford. And Henry Ford was a raging anti-Semite, published the protocols of the Elders of Zion in his own private newspaper that he would hand out with like every new Ford that he sold. There would be a version of the protocols of the Elders of Zion passed out with the car.
Wow.
And I forget which way. I think it was, I can't remember which way it was, but I think that like Adolf Hitler had a picture of Henry Ford in his office because he like, or it might've been the other way around, but
right.
So like this is all like everything's influencing everything. But Nesta Webster, 1876 to 1960, she was British, and she is one of the people who is credited with having popularized the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was published in a fairly large newspaper in, I want to say, London. And she was there was a group of people who were like contributing to this. She was one of the people who contributed to this and like helped helped mainstream the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And she was a prolific author. She wrote a bunch of books, and she basically like quoted Robeson and Beruel and their Illuminati conspiracy theories and their anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, as well as Leo Taxiel. So she's quoting Leo Taxiel and his like anti-Masonic conspiracy theories, which were proven to be a hoax. So it just shows you like where all of this information is coming from. It's just coming from nonsense. And they're like pseudo-intellectuals, and they are afraid of Satanism. And Luciferianism. And like that was a whole part of the Leo Taxiel hoax, is that there's a difference between Satanism and Luciferianism, because like one believes that Satan is evil and they like that, they're into it, and the other one believes that Adonai is actually the bad guy of the Bible and Satan is actually the good guy of the Bible, and we've just like been misinterpreting it. And so that's what the Palladians were. But Nesta Webster, she kind of like takes all of these conspiracy theories, like packages them in the 1900s. So she takes the 1790s Illuminati conspiracy theory books and kind of just like plagiarizes them, adds to them, modernizes them for the 20th century, and is wildly successful at this. And she had an incredible amount of influence in a way that like nobody knows about her, you know? So like she influenced Henry Ford, and she was quoting these like much older texts and kind of playing off the same. She was in the world of occult. And so like the Rosicrucians and the Order of the Golden Dawn, and, you know, the 1850s to 1950s was like this rise in like occultism. And they were very popular for saying our occult secret order started with this magical event, and this is exactly how the Rosicrucians started. You know, it was like a claim that like, oh, like we're actually much older than we actually are, and we have this secret beginning, and you know, we can tie our history all the way back to the Magi of Persia and the magicians of ancient Egypt and things. And, you know, and some Freemason groups will do kind of the same thing. The Rosicrucians did the same thing. And so what Nesta Webster did was she took all of these sources, like Eliphas Levi was like a huge occult influence in around that time, and like took them on face value and was just like, yeah, see, like they're so old, they go all the way back to Persia, Magi. This is so evil. Like there's this through line of Satanism, like from the dawn of time. And so she like repackages all of that for a modern audience. And then, and this leads us into modern. Now we have hit where the rest of those histories of white Christian nationalism pick up with the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and the birth of modern white Christian nationalism. And you have Tim LaHaye, who I personally think is one of the most important people in the founding of white Christian nationalism. Everybody focuses on Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. Tim LaHaye was kind of in the background. He started the Council for National Policy. If you follow the money, this is the group that like funnels like billions of dollars into all of these like right-wing think tanks and things. And, you know, Tim LaHaye authored the Left Behind series. And and also like a whole bunch of other really terrible books about like the unhappy gays and like how evil and the militant homosexuals are and stuff. And, you know, he in Rapture Under Attack, which is one of his books, he says he has read at least 50 books on the Illuminati. Like he believed in the Illuminati, and he had this entire like conspiratorial worldview from these influences, from Nesta Webster. And that's where Left Behind came from. This like warped conspiracy theory, like brain fog. Pat Robertson, in his book, The New World Order, which was published in 1991, a huge bestseller, directly quotes Nesta Webster as a source, and also quotes Albert Pike from the Taxiel hoax.
Oh my gosh.
Where Albert Pike says like, oh, we love to worship Satan or whatever. That's not a direct quote. So Pat Robertson, the guy who ran the Christian Coalition and the 700 Club, and he ran for president one year and is this massive influence onto modern evangelicalism, was quoting Nesta Webster, a Nazi. And as was Tim LaHaye and Jack Chick from the Chick Tracts. I want to say also in 1991. The quote from Albert Pike was "Lucifer is God," which comes from Taxiel, not from Albert Pike. And so the Chick tracts are being influenced by, and he wasn't reading the Taxial hoax because most of those texts, all of those texts, were never translated into English. So I've had a really hard time finding the source references for these things because they're all in French. I don't speak French. So he was not getting it from Taxiel. He was getting it from Nesta Webster, who was, again, a Nazi. And then and other people like Mike Warnke, who had...
Oh, God.
Yeah.
That's a name I haven't heard in a few years. Yeah.
He, the Satan Seller, was one of the, like, he was instrumental in the 1980 Satanic Panic and setting off this whole idea of like teenage Satanists like in the woods and
sacrificing people. And he was full of it.
And like the ritualistic satanic abuse and like this whole wave of recovering lost memories for people that like kicked off the Satanic Panic.
Oh my God.
Also, like, were influenced by Tim LaHaye and Nesta Webster and the Taxial hoax and like all, and and which is all coming from Robeson and Beruel and these deeply, deeply anti-Semitic texts and conspiracy theories. And there's absolutely no basis for them. There's not a leg to stand on. There's nothing redeemable about them. They are made up nonsense and made up hateful nonsense that you can see the direct effect that it has had with the rise in hate crimes, with World War II, with the Holocaust, with and so like all of this is basically to say, like, why did all of the evangelicals fall for QAnon? That was my starting point. That was like, why are my parents not taking the vaccine? Why are my parents stockpiling hydroxychloroquine? And there's so many different ways you can approach that question. There's so many different ways that you can answer it. But like, for me, like, it comes down to the totalistic ideology of white Christian nationalism. And, where does that come from? The history of it, how it has infiltrated government is incredibly important. But then also, where does it come from? And if you take it all the way back as far as you can, it is so much worse than what anybody is really wanting to address. And that's my tale. That's my story.
Wow. That's amazing. And you did a really good job actually closing that off at the 1 hour point. I was thinking, she's never going to do it. She's never going to do it. That is so fascinating. Thank you for introducing me and all our listeners and viewers out there to some of the actual names and history behind the nonsense, behind the dangers of QAnon and white Christian nationalism. I hope your book will be finished soon so that people can buy it. Do you have any idea of how long you think it'll be?
People have been asking me this for over a year at this point. I'm working on it. This whole Nesta Webster rabbit hole is kind of like I think the last puzzle piece, but it is something that I kind of just recently in the last couple of months was put onto and then have been like doing a deep dive onto. So I'm not gonna give it. I can't give it time. I'm not a writer, so like I don't really know what I'm doing, but I am working on it, and I am hoping to. I'm gonna try to go down the path of like traditional publishing, but if that fails, I will be self-publishing just to do whatever I can to get it out.
Right.
Oh, and then the one other like little tie that I wanted to mention to this, because I think that it's just like everything is awful, is that Nesta Webster was raised in the Plymouth Brethren doctrine, which was founded by this guy named John Darby, who is basically the father of modern dispensationalism and futurism, which and sola scriptura, which believes that like the Bible is the sole infallible source of authority. So basically, John Darby is kind of credited with the modern idea of rapture. And that is Nesta Webster's background. And then Nesta Webster is influenced Tim LaHaye, who is the one who like massively popularized this whole idea of the rapture for us
my
now.
God.
So,
Yes.
yes, sorry.
Wow.
Last thing.
But it just about gives a person a headache. I'm wondering, well, you still, has your relationship endured with your parents and your brother?
I was never like super close with my brother, so
Okay.
we have not spoken in a very long time. And I unfortunately have had to go formally like no contact with my parents after the election.
Yeah.
I had many conversations with them trying to explain you know, what it is that they believed, what my feelings were, and I'm not a psychologist, so don't take like mental health advice from me or anything. But I believe that they are emotionally not emotionally mature enough to really process a lot of that. And eventually,
a lot of people are in the cult.
Yes, and a lot of people are in my exact boat of having to go no contact with their families. And and a lot of people, especially like online, they write it off as just being like an easy thing to do or a flippant decision. And I am right there with anybody else who is in this situation and can absolutely confirm that it is not an easy decision to make. It was after years of a lot of really uncomfortable conversations, and and eventually, like, I may choose to re-engage. The whole point of me writing my book was to try to have this conversation with them, but I have kind of had to let go of the idea that it will make a difference for them. But I do very much believe that there are a lot of people like me who need need somebody to be like, yeah, this sucks.
Right.
And have a little bit more explanation.
That's right. Yes, because as far as I know, or as far as I've heard, your work is the work that has been going the farthest back to try and, figure out where did this stuff all originate. I really appreciate you giving so much of your time and energy to come visit me twice on the Divorcing Religion podcast. And so your website is takingoffthetinfoilhat.com, and your book will be ready whenever it's ready.
Yes,
that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much. And I have a lot of ex-evangelical deconstruction reading resources listed on that website as well. So that's what I always like to share.
Thank you. Okay. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. Boy, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. It's really interesting stuff. Thank you, everyone. And please take care. We'll see you again soon.